And last year, 64 million birds were counted. We'll find out sometime soon how many birds were counted this year. Anyway, so to tell you all about our efforts here in Palm Beach County, I give you Chuck Weber. And remember, questions for Chuck, please put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can after he presents about our own efforts in Palm Beach County. Chuck, if you want to share your screen.
Okay, thank you so much, Scott. And I'm going to get started here. So as Scott mentioned, our 2022-23 West Palm Beach Christmas bird count took place Monday, January 2nd. It was a very interesting count. We were very pleased that we had our highest species total in 45 years, which is really quite an accomplishment given our highly urbanized count circle. We'll talk more about that in a second. We also had fewer birds this year, though. That was the downside. So right here is one of the reasons we had a high species count this year, that we had a long list of either rare or hard to find birds in Palm Beach County. And this is one of them, red knot, the photo here from Gail Silverblatt, the bird seen at South Palm Park by Gail and her husband Howard and Pam Schneider.
I'm sorry, Chuck.
Team.
Chuck, I'm sorry,
Yep.
but we're not seeing your screen. So if you could share your screen, we're still seeing you.
All right.
I'll let you know when we can see your screen.
All right.
Remember the screen share button on the bottom of your screen?
Yeah, there we go. Let me try it again. Do you see that?
No, we still don't see it.
Okay.
Is Chuck's screen the host? Yeah.
All right.
So try pressing the green button again, and it should ask you which screen you want to share. It should show the screen.
Okay. All right. I don't do this often. I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's all right. We're all excited. We'll all wait patiently for you.
Are you seeing anything right now?
No, we're not yet, Chuck. I'm sorry. Chuck was able to, oh, there we go. Wonderful,
Oh
Chuck.
my gosh.
It's okay. Great. Thank you,
so
Chuck.
Sorry. I am just not used to this. All right. Can you see the screen now or see the graphic there?
Yes, Chuck, we can. It's perfect.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. Okay, sorry about that. I apologize. So our bird count took place on Monday, January 2nd, and we had a very interesting count this year, highest species count in 45 years, but we had fewer birds this year. One of the reasons we had a high species count, we had a nice long list of rare birds or hard to find birds in Palm Beach County, and this is one of them right here. This is red knot. The photo is from Gail Silverblatt, and the bird was seen on count day at South Palm Park in Lake Worth Beach. Gail and her husband Howard and Pam Schneider got the bird. Gail had known that this bird was around. She found the bird in the days and weeks prior to the count, and she got it on count day. And this is only the second time that we've had the bird on our count. Now you may be saying, well, Chuck, this bird is not red at all. And you're absolutely right. This is one of our shorebirds that is in its winter basic plumage. I guarantee you that as spring and summer approaches, this bird will probably get its red feathers, and it's a beautiful bird. The conservation issues associated with red knots are well known, and this species has suffered a dramatic population decline. So we're always grateful to get a red knot here in the county. It's a very tough bird anywhere, and I just forwarded too fast. I'm sorry. Oh no. Okay, start over. All right, so red knot was one of our best birds on the count. Here's another great bird for the count, white-crowned sparrow. The photo here from Larry Gladson, beautiful photo. This was at Seacrest Scrub Natural Area. John Shelley had found a juvenile white-crowned sparrow, likely the same bird, a few days before the count. And he and his team, his wife Chada, Luann Dillon, and Larry Gladstone found the bird again on count day. And this is just the third time we've had white-crowned sparrow on the count. This bird is present most years in our county. And I say most years, not every year, but usually out in western Palm Beach County, much more likely there. But the scrub areas in the coastal region, well, they can have sparrows as well. And so good job by John finding this bird. The Yellowthroated Vireo here, another rarer bird. This is the 10th time on our count. Spillway Park, the location, Mark Calvert, a beautiful photo here. Kathy and Mark tried in the morning for this bird. Gail Silverblatt actually found the bird before the count. And so we knew it was around, and Kathy and Mark tried in the morning, didn't get it. They went back in the afternoon and got the bird. And again, the 10th time on our count, very pleased to get that. Reddish egret, photo again from Gail Silverblatt. We know for a fact that there were two birds. This one here at Snook Island's natural area, and we've been seeing one for quite a while, for a couple months anyway, at Boynton Inlet. And Gail had had the one at Snook Islands. And then we know for sure there are two birds because our boat team, David Simpson and Beto Mateus, they were out in the intracoastal doing a survey for our count. And they saw the two birds together, or two birds together, one chasing the other just north of Boynton Inlet. So we know there were at least two birds, and this is just the 10th time on our count, the first since 2008. So glad to get reddish egret back again. Chuck Will's widow, the photo here from Nolan Meyer. This is a very unique looking bird, kind of a weird looking bird even, and it's in the family called nightjars. They make loud noises during the breeding season at night generally, or in the early morning hours. That's how they get their name, nightjar. They've become very tough to get on our count in the last 25, 30 years. Last year, there were multiple Chuck Will's widows reported on our count. And this year we had 3 birds. This one here at Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge. There was also a bird at Lantana Preserve. Also a bird on Palm Beach County Environmental Resources Management property out west of 441. So multiple teams reported this bird as well as the 3 birds, and good to get Chuck Will's widow, very unique bird. We don't often see them resting like this, but fortunately this bird has been seen behind the visitor center at Loxahatchee quite a bit in around count period there. So around the count time. So that was nice to get. Eastern whippoorwill, another nightjar. 4th year in a row, Carl Edwards has got this bird. Good to have on the count again. A tough bird to get in recent years. Black scoter, only the 11th time on the count. Richard Crosley, glad to have author Richard Crosley join our count again. He got it at Lake Worth Beach, and then Lawrence Gardenhire got probably some of the same birds down at Boynton Inlet. Clapper rail, just a fantastic discovery, a fantastic find. The first on our count since 1980, Bob Diederich and Doreen LePage got that bird. Western kingbird, the first time on the count since 2002. Carl Edwards and his team got the bird. Sedge wren, the first time since 2011. Rick Newman and his team. Worm-eating warbler, only the 5th time on our count. Kyle, Kenny, and Marcello at Loxahatchee Refuge got the worm-eating warbler. Cape May warbler, just the 7th time on our count. Marcus Kelly, Mikey Green, and Mark Pinkower got that bird. So when we have a long list of rarities like this, that really boosts our species total. It's also gratifying to see, knowing that we have a count circle that is so urbanized, to have this many rare and good birds, and birds that you would normally see out in rough, scruffy areas. And we do have a few rough, scruffy areas here in our count circle, but it's much more urbanized than when the count circle was first struck back in 1963. And I'm showing the circle because people often ask, well, where are you counting? Do you do this Christmas count? Where are you counting? What's the CBC all about? Well, each CBC that's conducted anywhere is done within a preset 15-mile diameter circle. And this is our circle from the National Audubon website. The center of the circle about Hypoluxo and Haverhill. And as you can see, it takes in part of Loxahatchee Refuge out to the west and a sliver of Atlantic Ocean to the east, part of the Barrier Island. It goes almost as far north as Southern Boulevard and then down to about Atlantic and Military. So very urbanized. We divide up this circle into territories and send our teams out. We had 31 different teams this year. And so we do the best to count all the birds that we can. And this year we did very well. As I mentioned at the top, 153 what we call countable species. These are species that are established in our area per the ornithologists, and the 153 countable species was our highest total since 1977. And back in 77, we had about 155 countable species. Our record number of species is 164 back in the 1960s. So we got a ways to go to get that, but 153 species is very good. And there's even a couple more species that are under review by our state compilers. And so we were quite pleased with that. However, there were 17 of these species that were represented by just one individual. And then there were another group of species that were represented by just two individuals, seen perhaps by just one team. So we feel a bit tenuous in this achievement of having a high species count. And we feel kind of, we're very pleased, but we know that we could easily have had a lot fewer species. Last year, we had 146 species. So we had 7 more than last year. Why more this year? Maybe it's because we had calm conditions early and it was very, very warm, which actually made the birding very slow and tough as the day wore on. But last year it was windy from the time the sun came up. So that presented some major problems for us. I mean, it just made the birding tougher. We still came up with 146 species, so not too bad. 89 participants this year, 78 last year. So we had a few more people out in the field. That may account for more species. But on a down note, we had fewer birds. And, you know, I say it's a down note, maybe it's just the way things were this year. We had 22,000, nearly 23,000 birds recorded last year by our counters. And this year, just over 19,000. So significantly less, but one of the reasons may be smaller flocks of wading birds and grackles. And the water levels may affect the wading birds. We had still some big flocks, especially of white ibis. That's one of the most prolific species on our count, but still not as many as we had last year and in some of the preceding years. Grackles the same way, still some huge flocks of grackles, but not as big as the ones that we saw last year and in other recent years. Also, we just had the sense this year there were fewer birds around, especially out in some of our wild areas. Species like house wren and catbirds, they've been down, especially house wrens, they've been down for the last few years, it seems. That's the way it feels to the birders, and definitely low numbers on our count again this year. So that may account for the lower number of total birds. But we're pleased with the species count, and we definitely want to thank all of our counters. They did a fantastic job in the field for us to get a big species number like that. It requires a lot of team effort and people out in the field working hard. We also got into some new communities, country club community. Linda McCandless and Sue Young got into a country club that we hadn't had access to before, and they got our only 2 bald eagles on the count. Rick and Linda Burns have been doing this for many years, and they've been at a country club for a number of years. And so we're trying to get more of our highly urbanized count circle covered, and our counters are making it happen. Also want to thank Scott Zucker and the Audubon Everglades board. They're always supporting the Christmas bird count effort, and Scott and the board paid for a beautiful compilation dinner this year. We resumed having an in-person compilation this year, and we had about 40 people there. It was a very nice time, and so Scott and the board were thankful for your providing the space for the compilation and also a wonderful meal. Also, the gas for Beto's boat, which they were able to do our intracoastal survey. And so thank you so much to Scott and the board. Big thank you to the CBC committee. Scott mentioned this before the meeting. We have a committee now that's been working on the CBC for the past few years, and wonderful group, and providing fantastic input, fantastic work to make this happen. Doreen LePage, really just our co-chair, really, she does so much. And Linda McCandless, Rick Schofield, Gail Silverblatt, Bob Dieterich, thank you to you all. And we've already met and talked about this year's count, and we've already set a date for next year. So there's the date on the screen. Put it on your calendar, Saturday, December 30th. And we are planning on that already. So we're quite pleased with that.
Okay, Chuck, that was wonderful. By the way, I didn't mention when I introduced Chuck that Chuck has, I think you've been leading the count now in the county for 16 or 17 years.
Right, I've been doing it since about 2004. Yeah, 2005. And I've helped with the count before that, but yeah.
Right. But Chuck's been our leader for that long. So it's been a long time. And I don't know how much work it is because I've not done it. I've only heard how much work it is. And we can't thank Chuck enough for the work that he does, because this is such an important citizen science project. And we value it extremely at Audubon Everglades. And thank you, Chuck.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have some questions, and hopefully we're going to get some more. Jeanette says, you birders are amazing. Early days and big lenses and a lot of patience. God bless, thank you. And then Jeanette asks a question. Do you see a cyclical rise and fall in populations?
I think we do. The night jars, for instance, I was talking about them. Why are we seeing them just in the last couple of years? I think that's an example. Some years we can't find them anywhere in our count circle, and they're tough to get pretty much anywhere in winter, or they seem to be tougher to find. And then the last couple of years, well, we have several on our count, several Chuck Will's widows anyway, and the whippoorwills are still tougher to get, but that's an example perhaps. And I do see, I think climate change perhaps is why we're seeing more wintering warblers in our area. I mentioned the Cape May warbler, worm-eating warbler. We're seeing more in wintertime here, much more than we used to. So there are definitely cycles. Some of it's maybe related to climate, some of it's maybe just naturally happening.
Thank you, Chuck. There's a wonderful comment from Steve Weston. In Minnesota, the highest count number of species so far was 80, with 90% of the counts reporting. The total so far was 130 species for the entire state of Minnesota. So I know it's a very different climate, but Chuck, do you want to speak to that?
Well, that puts it in perspective. I mean, we really are blessed with a great opportunity here in the wintertime to see a lot of different kinds of birds. And in our CBC circle, even though it's very urbanized, we still get a lot of really good birds. And yeah, that says a lot right there. Nolan Meyer, his photo of the Chuck Will's widow we used, he's from Minnesota. He coordinates, he's in college, but he coordinates a CBC up there in a rural area. And I think he said they had 39 or 40 species on their count. So to have even close to 150 species, yeah, this is nice. Even though the birding was tough this year, as the day wore on, I mentioned that, but we still got some good birds, and it's a lot of fun.
Thank you. Yeah, I can attest to that. I was on the Christmas bird count, and once it hit like 1 o'clock, the birds just said, we're taking a siesta for the rest of the day. So a couple of other questions besides a number of people complimented you on the presentation. Rick Scofield says, thank you, Chuck, for a great presentation. June Porter, excellent report. Thanks all birders who participated. And by the way, how many birders did participate this year?
We had 89 participants. I maybe didn't emphasize that enough. We had 89 counters this year. That was a little bit more than last year, 78. So we're very grateful for everyone who came out.
Great. Christopher Madden says, thanks, Chuck, wonderful presentation. Bob Dietrich, I know one on the committee, says, what species were missed that we usually get? Good question.
Yeah, there were several. I should have anticipated that question. I know we didn't get sharp-shinned hawk. That's one that, we usually get one or two sharp-shinned hawks. If we get them at all, that's a tough one to get anymore, it seems. We missed sharp-shinned hawk, that comes to mind. We missed burrowing owl. Alan Summerskill, he has had a large area, and he was our best hope for a burrowing owl, but there's only a few places, and they've moved around a little bit, but burrowing owl was a miss this year. Also, while I was talking about Alan Summerskill, and we talked about some of the species that we got this year, we only had one individual. Alan got the last eastern meadowlark in our count circle. I mean, they used to be pretty numerous, but we have just one eastern meadowlark, and Alan has gotten this bird for the last few times. So that's an example. Back to Bob's question, what did we miss? We had a few misses. We also, some things that we tend to miss more often anymore, but we had some good numbers. Talk about cycles of bird patterns. We had more Forster's terns in the count circle in the general area than we've had for a number of years. Bonaparte skulls, we had the highest number in a number of years, and there are just more of those birds around for some reason, whatever reason.
Okay, great. Thank you. And hopefully we'll see some of those birds next year. Maybe the weather had something to do with a little bit of that, the unusually warm day. Jeanette asks, would you have wanted more participants? She thought it perhaps there was no more participants needed for the count.
We always can. We could have used a few more in the end. We thought we were pretty well set, but some things didn't work out quite as we expected. But we could have used a few more, and that's one of the things the committee is talking about right now. Is we'll probably do a little bit more publicity. If people come out of the woodwork, we got to find a place for them, though, and which is a good dilemma to have. But we could have used maybe a few more people in a couple of key spots, but overall, 89 counters, that's pretty good. But in the end, we probably could have used just a few more. Yeah.
In terms of more people, and I guess there's another question from Christopher Madden, how many sites were counted? Could you use more sites, for example, more areas like HOAs where there are gated communities and you can't count?
Absolutely. Scott, that's a great point. And we, a few years back, the last count before COVID, we really made a more concerted effort to get into more of these gated communities and private communities, golf courses. As I mentioned, Linda McCandless got into this one country club where we had the bald eagles this year, and we were grateful for that. We'll probably try to pursue more of those opportunities, and we have a few leads on a couple other private golf courses or communities, but we could definitely use more help in that regard. And people, if they live in their communities, for instance, I know there are a few counters that, basically they go out and maybe cover an area, but when they get back home or before they go out to their area, they, will submit a list from their home in their gated community. And that's another way we can get some coverage in some of these private communities. So we're definitely open to that. If you are in a gated community, then yeah, let me know and I'll sign you up.
Jeanette asked, what about county golf courses? I see many birds there in Palm Beach County.
Yeah, we have one county golf course, and we haven't been in there now the last couple times, but well, I say we've been around the periphery of it, but we, of course, with golf courses, we got to get out there early and get off early so as not to interfere with golf on a very, very busy golf day. Generally this time of year is just very busy there. So that's a good point, and that's one of the areas we're going to pursue, trying to get back on that county course. Well, actually, there's 2 county courses. I misspoke. And so, yeah, we're going to work on that.
Rhea Moss, I think, has a wonderful suggestion. You can correct me if I'm wrong. She says, why not contact COBRA, which is the Boynton Beach community of homeowners, home of HOAs, to encourage HOA participation, because they would have access to all of the presidents of all the HOAs, and perhaps they could be a go-between to be able to get into some of these communities.
Yes, thank you, Rhea. That's a great idea, and Rhea is great to let us into her community. Scott counted there and this year, and so we're thankful for that. And we will. That's a great idea. I think we'll, and I may be reaching out to you, Rhea, and we'll work on that. That's a great suggestion.
Jerry D. Dominic said he had, I guess, I volunteered, I think it's a she, by the spelling. I volunteered to assist, but didn't hear back from anyone and didn't have any more info. So I guess when people are interested and you're full, I guess sometimes things fall through the cracks a little bit.
Well, I did, anyone who contacted me via email or any other way, I did get back to. I'm not sure who this individual is. I don't know, maybe, I don't know what happened there, but.
Yeah, I'm not sure who Jerry contacted. Hopefully it wasn't me and I missed on it. And if I did, I apologize, Jerry. And perhaps next year you'll be able to participate. Leslie Coolidge says, any flexibility on the circle? Most of Wellington seems to be just out of it.
You're absolutely right. Peaceful Waters, what a great place. We were talking about that before the meeting. Oh my lands, be great if we could have that in our count circle, but it's just outside the count circle by a short distance. And there are other places, but the count circle was set back in 1963, I believe I mentioned, and we could move the count circle, but any place you move the count circle, then you lose some of the areas that are in there. If we moved it out to include Peaceful Waters or Wellington Environmental Preserve, those places would be great, but then we wouldn't be able to include the coast.
Right, of course.
And so it's a balancing act. We could potentially move the circle. We can't overlap another circle. And yeah, our circle is very urbanized, as I've mentioned several times. And but yet we still find birds and still enjoy doing the count there. But that's yeah. I wish those Wellington spots were in the circle. I do.
Yeah. So I must say one more comment. This was again from Jeanette, who asked about the county golf courses, and you had mentioned that they're the golfers, so we have to get there before the golfers. So her comment was just wear a helmet.
Well, there you go.
Which I
great
love.
Idea.
Thank you, Jeanette. That's all for the questions. Chuck, thank you so much. And thank you for doing such a wonderful job with the CBC for all these years. And I know all of us counters look forward to next year. And it's always an exciting time and to get out there and be exhausted by the end of the day and then go for the compilation. But it is a great day. And it's for a great reason. Remember, the count is used for citizen science. All the information goes into eBird. And for many of you who are familiar with eBird, it is used by scientists all over the world. There's been, I think last year, there were 600 studies that came out of using eBird information. These are scientific studies that were published that came out using eBird information. So what you do as counters is critical. And thank you, Chuck, for making this happen, and for all the work that you and the committee have done this year.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we're going to move on to our next presenter of the evening. Let me get to that. And hang on, share screen. There we go. Okay, and so whoops, what's that? What's that? All right. Hang on. There we go. All right, so our featured presenter of the evening is Dr. Mark Cook. Dr. Mark Cook, by the way, just before Autumn Quixote introduces Mark, I think Autumn Quixote is, Natasha's going to be introducing Mark. Dr. Mark Cook is also on our Science Advisory Committee, and he has presented for Audubon Everglades a number of times in the past, including last year. And so I know many of you are familiar with him. Dr. Mark Cook has also led field trips for us. And we are so lucky to have his presence in Palm Beach County, and we so appreciate the work that he does for Audubon Everglades. But I'm going to let Natasha tell you more. So Natasha Warwick, who is one of our vice presidents. Natasha, please take it away.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Sorry for the last minute change. Autumn was having some technical difficulties, so I'm going to introduce Dr. Mark. I feel like Mark is somebody who doesn't need an introduction, but I'll go ahead and give it my best shot. So Dr. Cook has been studying in the field of conservation ecology and bird behavior for over 24 years. He received his PhD from Glasgow University in Scotland, where he studied the life history and breeding strategies of Arctic seabirds, which sounds really interesting. After his PhD, he spent 4 years as a postdoc at the University of California, Berkeley, studying Neotropical passerines. Currently, Mark is the section leader of the system-wide Everglades research group in the Applied Sciences Bureau at the South Florida Water Management District. That is there. He's responsible for leading a team of scientists who provide the scientific foundation for the management and restoration of freshwater flows in Everglades and Florida Bay. And that's just like a really simplified explanation of what he actually does. And on top of that, he's published over 50 manuscripts, book chapters, and reports, and he's the editor of the South Florida Wading Bird Report that comes out every year. And if that's not enough, he's also involved with multiple professional and technical committees, such as the Wood Stork Working Group and the Flamingo Working Group. And there's so much that he does. So we're lucky that you were able to carve out the time for us today. Mark, thank you so much. So with that, we're all going to learn about lessons from a hurricane and how to restore Everglades wading bird populations. Please remember to mute yourselves, and if you have questions, put them into the chat. We'll go over those at the end of the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Natasha. Can you all hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. And now, next step, share my screen. See if I can show Chuck how to do this. There we go. Is that working?
Yep, it's working.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, first of all, a little bit of a response to Chuck. He was talking about maybe a decline in seeing white ibis, this guy we have on the screen here in front of us. And in my mind, that's okay. This is one of the birds I work on primarily. And, you know, we are beginning to see more and more of them in these urban areas, but really where we want to see them is in the Everglades. And so a decline in these urban areas isn't always such a bad thing. And at that time, beginning of January, you know, I've been doing surveys over the Everglades, and we were seeing some absolutely enormous flocks of white ibis. So we're not missing those birds. They've just moved to where they should be. So maybe that's one, good news explanation for why Chuck saw a little bit of a decline. Anyway, so let me move on now to the presentation. I've got a whole bunch of things on my screen that's annoying me, and let's see if I can remove those so I can see my screen. There we go, and then we can start. Okay, so the title is Lessons from Hurricanes on How to Restore Everglades Wading Bird Populations. Last year, I gave you guys a presentation, and it was along a similar theme. I gave you an update on the incredible nesting responses that we've seen in the Everglades in recent years. But it was fairly descriptive and really just showing you the data of what we've seen. Today, I want to go maybe a step further and give some explanation of why we saw those amazing nesting responses. And so I've mentioned hurricanes. I had to come up with a title quickly. And the talk isn't so much about hurricanes, but without hurricanes, we wouldn't have been, and the amount of water that they drench the Everglades with, we wouldn't have been able to understand what we understand now about these birds. And so that's what this talk is about, how these conditions, how these amazing water levels prompted these amazing nesting responses for these birds, and the science that we did at the time to be able to understand those responses. And so without further ado, we'll move on. But before I get into the science and the studies that we did, I do need to give a bit of background information. So this photograph here is a flock of wading birds that are, this is what I typically see when I'm doing some of my surveys in the Everglades. This is actually part of a much larger flock, but it's a typical wonderful sight of what we see in the Everglades when we have great foraging conditions. We got mixed species flocks. We got pretty much all the main characters in here. You can see some roseate spoonbills, the pink birds in there. We've got wood storks, white ibis, multiple species of herons. And the reason why I'm showing you this picture is that the foundation of what I'm going to talk about, and the foundation of our science of wading birds in the Everglades is about what these birds eat. The main factor that limits wading bird populations in the Everglades is food availability, the prey that they eat, the fish and the crayfish and the other aquatic organisms that they rely on. These birds are not really affected by hunting anymore, or pollution or human disturbance. It's all about prey availability and how that's influenced by hydrologic conditions, water levels, and how long that water lasts for in the Everglades. So understanding how wading birds respond to these water levels and how that affects their foraging ecology is key to restoring their populations, basically. In short, these birds need shallow water and very high densities of prey. And that is absolutely key to their restoration. Now, these birds can be grouped into two main groups. We have the visual foragers. These are the herons and the egrets. These guys are designed with a S-shaped neck. Well, they've got different shaped vertebrae and different sized vertebrae in their necks that gives them this S-shaped curve to their necks. And on the end, and they have these really sharp bills, incredible visual acuity, and basically this is a spring-loaded mechanism to spear fish. And because they use sight primarily to catch their prey, they don't need really these high densities of prey. They need relatively high densities of prey, and they do better when there's high densities of prey. But relative to the tactile foragers, they don't need as high densities of prey. And because of that, some of these birds, the great egret and the great blue heron, for instance, these birds have actually increased in populations with the drainage of the Everglades and the way we've pondered the Everglades. And this is in stark contrast to the tactile foraging species, the white ibis that I show here and the woodstock. These birds, as the name suggests, they feed by touch. Okay, when they can only catch a prey by touching it. The woodstock, for instance, feeds with its head in the water. It's got its mouth open, and it's feeding in this sort of three-dimensional space. And it uses its one of its feet typically to sort of stir up the sediments and scare fish into its beak. And then as soon as that fish hits the beak, it rapidly shuts tight. And that reaction is one of the fastest reactions in the vertebrate kingdom, of the vertebrate animals. They can shut their beak in 0.25 of a second, which is about 400 times faster than the fastest blink that you can do. So their response times are incredible. The white ibis, on the other hand, which is our primary focus of this presentation, they feed primarily on the sediment surface. So at the bottom of the wetland on the sediment surface, and they're really going after crayfish. That's their primary food source, and other invertebrates. So they're feeding on a sort of two-dimensional plane. So they also need pretty high densities, but not necessarily as high densities as the woodstock. So what do we need then to create these really high densities of prey? What kind of conditions in the Everglades are necessary? Well, it's a two-stage process, and the first process is we need to produce the prey. We need to grow and produce these prey. And that's pretty simple. It's not rocket science. Fish and crayfish and these other aquatic animals, they need water, right? So the more water we have in the Everglades during the rainy season, this is the time that we're growing and producing all these prey. The more water we have, the deeper the water levels in the system, the greater the surface area of water across the landscape. That means there's more habitat. And also the deeper it is, the longer that water lasts into the dry season. So the longer it lasts, the more time these animals have to grow and reproduce. So more water, more prey. And in this top left-hand corner up here, actually, I'm just going to change this to a laser pointer here, so I can. There we go. And this figure up here in the top left corner basically shows that a study over many years showed that fish density, in this case for the bluefin killifish, you can see how fish density increases the longer that we have water in the system for. So simple relationship. More water, more prey. We need more water in the Everglades. But like I said earlier, these birds need shallow water to feed in. The birds can't feed when it's super deep. And so this figure on the left-hand side is a representation of this ridge and slough landscape that we have. And it shows on this top line here, the representation of the Everglades as we go through the dry season, with it gradually drying down and then refilling up with water again as the wet season starts in May. And corresponding with that is the response of the wading birds. And basically what's happening in November, it's far too deep in the system. The ridges, the higher elevation ridges and the tree islands, they're all covered in water, and the prey are dispersed across the landscape, okay? But as we get into the dry season, water levels come down, the ridges and the higher elevation habitats dry down, the prey are all moving into the deeper water areas. And as we continue into sort of the early spring, then we're really seeing these water levels drop. These aerial coverage of water is shrinking and shrinking. The water levels are getting shallower and shallower. So we're getting this smaller volumes and spatial area of water, and the prey are becoming more and more concentrated until we get to a stage like this picture in the right-hand corner over here, where we get these really high densities of prey that the birds can actually forage on. And so that's what we need to actually support. We need this dry down across the landscape. And these, obviously they dry down. Once they've dried down and the birds are feeding, the prey are all finished. So these prey concentration events don't last forever. They're ephemeral, and the birds need to move off and find new habitats. So we need this movement across the landscape of these great foraging areas. So to understand a little bit more about how birds sort of fit into the restoration of the Everglades, we need to understand what we've done to the Everglades. So here we have this figure on the left is, a stylized representation of what we think the Everglades looked like before drainage in the 1850s. And just to give, here's Lake Okeechobee, West Palm Beach, Miami. And the Everglades was aptly named as the river of grass. We would get these seasonal pulses of flow that would overflow Lake Okeechobee in the wet season, during the rainy season. It would flow through this massive sawgrass plain historically, and then into this main area of the Everglades called the ridge and slough landscape that we're all kind of familiar with. The parallel sawgrass ridges and lower elevation, deeper water sloughs, and sprinkled in amongst this were hundreds of thousands of tree islands, the biological hotspots of the Everglades. And this is the main feature of the Everglades. And as we move, and this area historically would stay fairly wet. It would dry down during the dry season, but unlike today, it didn't dry out completely. We would keep water in the system. And then water, as we move south, we have three main channels that empty into either Florida Bay via Taylor Slough, Shark River Slough into the Gulf of Mexico, and probably to some extent into Florida Bay as well. And then this well-named Lostman Slough, which from a restoration point of view, a lot of people have actually, forgotten about, and it's not really considered anymore. Most of the restoration is focused on Shark River Slough and Taylor Slough. And then once water goes through here, through these major sloughs, it goes through a series of coastal lakes and mangrove habitats and other wetland habitats into the bays and Gulf of Mexico. But one area that I want to point out here are these pink areas here. These are what we call the marl prairies. These are slightly higher elevation habitats. They're not as low elevation as the ridge and slough landscape. And so these areas actually dry out for a couple of months of year. And that is not conducive to producing fish, but it is very conducive to producing crayfish, which is a major staple of the white ibis diet. And the reason for that is because these predatory fish species like warmouth and other similar fishes prey on the baby crayfish, and by drying out for a couple of months each year, that reduces these predatory fish populations and enable these crayfish populations to do very well in these habitats. Okay, so these areas are very well, are potentially very important, and we'll talk more about that later on. And another area I want to point out is here, the Fertile Crescent. This is the sort of the mangrove region of the Western Everglades. This is where 90% of wading birds nested historically. So this area is also very important in terms of understanding. And a major goal of Everglades restoration is to actually get these birds nesting in this region again. But as is often the case, paradise found is paradise lost. And today, this is what the Everglades looks like. We've lost half to agricultural development, agricultural and urban development. And the remaining half of what we have left is drained by hundreds of miles of canals, and half of it is compartmentalized into these areas called the water conservation areas, which are surrounded by levees. So there's a lot less flow going into the Everglades, and what flow is going in is not flowing through these areas. And the main effect for what we want to talk about today is much less water is now flowing through Shark River Slough across these western marl prairies. So these marl prairies are now far too dry. Instead of a 10-month period of being wet, they're now down in some places to just a month or two. And these coastal regions they're also much drier and also too saline. So prey productivity is considerably reduced in these areas. And this has had major implications and consequences for the ecology of the system. And not least for the wading birds. Since the 1940s, between the 1940s and the early 2000s, we saw a major drop in wading bird populations, particularly for these tactile foraging species, the white ibis and the white ibis and the white ibis and the woodstock. And although we have seen quite an improvement in recent years, which I will highlight in a minute, we've also seen a movement of those colonies that I was talking about, those historic colonies in the coastal region in the Fertile Crescent. These have largely disappeared. There's only, in the 90s, there was just a couple of hundred birds nesting in these areas. And these birds have either moved into the conservation areas where they really weren't nesting before, although in much lower numbers, obviously, than they were currently nesting in these coastal regions. And then finally, most depressingly of all, is that these birds are now nesting much later in the year, and that results in much lower nesting success. And this figure here shows the egg-laying date of the woodstock. Typically, it was, historically in the 1950s, about the time when we were really starting to gear up drainage of the Everglades. These birds were nesting in November, December. And we can see that as drainage has occurred, we're now seeing nesting starting in January, February, and even March in some years. And this has had major impacts on the nest success of these birds. So, and the reason why is because these birds have a very long nesting period. It's about 4 months. So when they were nesting in November, December, they were getting their chicks off the nest in February, March, April. Now, however, when they're nesting in January, February, March, they are not getting their chicks off until the beginning of the wet season in the end of April and May and June. And what happens then is, these birds need these high concentration events, but when we get the rains, the water fills up in the Everglades again. These fish and crayfish these birds are feeding on disperse back into the wetland, and there's no food for these birds to catch for their young, and we get some really, and basically the nestlings just starve to death because there just isn't the available food for them. And this image just highlights this. This was back in 2020, a couple of years ago, when we had very late nesting. Here's an adult woodstock. Behind it is a nest full of nestling bones. And here it's watching a vulture feeding on the remains of another nestling. This year, basically, we had loads of chicks, good numbers of nests, but about 90% of them perished simply because they nested too late. But having said that, all that bad news, I think we're actually on the cusp of some very good news, some real improvements in Everglades, and particularly the wading bird populations. In the last few years, we've had a number of hurricanes and tropical storm events, such as Tropical Storm Eta, that have, in combination with some new restoration initiatives, that have really really improved the hydrology of the system, created these really super wet conditions that we need in the wet season. And this has created some incredible nesting responses, just like, as I explained last year in the presentation I gave. But today, what I want to talk about is how these amazing conditions have provided us with information and knowledge that we weren't able to get during previous, decades that have been just so dry, relatively speaking, and haven't provided us with those conditions that we had historically. And so these new conditions have really enlightened us as to in respect to wading bird ecology and what is required to be able to actually restore some of these massive nesting events, and particularly in the coastal colonies that we used to see historically. And so today that's going to be the focus of my talk, on how these hurricanes and these wet conditions really provided us the information that we need to be able to restore these birds. And so at the remainder of this talk, I'm going to briefly go over the wading bird nesting responses that we've had over the last 30 odd years or so, with highlights of those 2018 and 2021 nesting responses. And I did that last year, but for those who haven't seen it, it's kind of necessary that I show that again. And it's such good news, and it's such, it's just fun to talk about that I'm sure you don't mind seeing that again. And then I'm going to go on and talk about the science that we did during those periods that have helped us to understand the wading bird ecology. And don't worry, it's going to be very light. It's not going to be heavy in statistics and numbers and everything. It's going to be a very light. I'm just going to basically show you what we've learned rather than the science behind it. Okay, so let's look at the nesting patterns that we've seen over the last 32 years or so. So this figure shows the number of nests for our 4 indicator species that we have for Everglades restoration. That's the white ibis, woodstock, great egret, and snow egret combined over the last 32 years or so. And we can see some very interesting patterns here. We can see that prior to the year 2000, nesting was absolutely terrible. We had, only in the region of, less than an average of about 10,000 nests, which, considering we had, 100, 200,000 historically is extremely low. But then we can see, we've seen this, rapid uptick in nesting at about the turn of the millennium, up to about 31,000 nests, which corresponds to a number of things. We're not entirely sure what the reason was, but it corresponds with a slightly wetter sort of climatic conditions, decadal climatic conditions at this period. There's been a decline in mercury pollution. There were laws changed to prevent mercury pollution. But I think one of the major reasons is that this is the time that we really, the ecologists, the wading bird ecologists and the water managers really started to speak to one another and figure out ways that we could manage the system better for the birds. And I think that is the main reason why we've seen this huge uptick. Other things we can note here is we can see a lot of variability in the number of nests we get from year to year, from 60-odd thousand down to 10,000. And that variability is absolutely natural. It's okay to have good years and then relatively bad years. This is how birds did it historically. We would have 200, in the 1930s and 40s, there would be 100,000 one year and 20, 30,000 or lower the next. This is simply just reflective of changes in hydrologic conditions and the prey availability that's associated with that. So this is what we want to see. We want to see every 2 to 3 years these peaks, but in between it's okay to have these lows. And we've also seen some really nice years. Like 2009, we had over 63,000 nests for these 4 species. That's pretty remarkable. That's really good. And then in the last 10 years or so, at least leading up to 2017, everything kind of went flat again, and we weren't really getting those peaks. That is until the fall of 2000, actually, the summer of 2017, when we had I can't remember which tropical storm we had at the beginning of the season, but then in September, we had Hurricane Irma. And the combination of that very wet season and fall created water levels in the Everglades that we hadn't seen for decades. And in combination with that, the following dry season was it was dry enough that it created this beautiful dry down, and all the prey that have been produced during these very wet conditions became beautifully concentrated and moved across the landscape, providing ideal foraging conditions for these birds. And the response to that for the birds, I still get excited about showing this, was this. 116,000 nests. That's just for these 4 species. When we add some of the other species, the rarer ones, I think the total was nearing 123,000 nests in the Everglades, which is just remarkable. Given that this is about 4 times the average, and almost double the high, the previous banner year we had in 2009. Following that, again, we had, these low numbers, much drier conditions, average conditions, but that we've been seeing over, the last couple of decades, but nonetheless, much drier. And again, as we expected, nesting was reduced. But then in November, we had a very late tropical storm. It occurred in early November. Again, this dropped some of the highest rainfall on the Everglades we've seen in decades. In fact, it created wetter conditions than Hurricane Irma. And the response to that, again, was another huge nesting event. Not quite as good as in 2018, but 83,000 nests. So not only did we have one amazing year, we had 2 that kind of represents the historical pattern of peaks and troughs that we would expect to see in the pre-drainage era. So wonderful to see that. This is great news for a whole number of reasons. Obviously, to get that many birds nesting and all the nestlings that they provide to add to the populations of these birds. But it also means that the Everglades and these wading bird populations are highly resilient. If we get the water right again, like we did in these 2 years, even if it was to some extent produced by nature, then we can recover these birds. It shows that restoration will work. And it shows that the Everglades can be recovered. But also the fact that we can do this, it shows that Everglades works. And this is really important when we go to our water managers and restoration managers and the people pulling the purse strings of Everglades restoration. We can go, hey, look, this works. Beforehand, we had all these hypotheses about how Everglades restoration was going to work. Here we have it in black and white that it will work if we get the water right again. And then just new data, not terribly exciting after all that, but this is what we had last year. Again, drier conditions. We predicted a much reduced nesting effort, and that is exactly what we got. So that's kind of the pattern that we're seeing in terms of nesting. But it wasn't just about the nesting. We have many different indicators for the health of these wading bird populations. Just a couple more here. Not only did we have so many nests, but the nest success was incredible in both of these years. This photo, I'm not going to show data, but this says it all. This is in stark contrast to those nests I showed earlier with the bones and the vultures feeding on chicks. This shows these wood storks. These birds typically lay two to three eggs. Each of these nests has just got 3, or sometimes 4 very healthy young woodstock nestlings. And we saw so many of these birds fledge that they really made there was a significant increase probably to the nesting populations of these birds. Not only that, and probably more interesting from my perspective, is that we also saw these birds move to the coast. Now that is a major goal of Everglades restoration. For a functioning Everglades, we need these birds to be going back to the coast. It shows that we're getting enough water down there and that the system, the hydrology is right again, if we can get these birds nesting down in these coastal. And it wasn't until about 10, 15 years ago that we really had any more than a handful of birds nesting on the coast. About 10, 15 years ago, we started to get these birds slowly increasing again in the coastal region. And we were seeing an average up until about 2017 of about 4,000 nests. But in 2018, we saw almost 40,000 nests in these colonies. And in 2021, 30,000 nests. So, in 2018, that was an order of magnitude more than we'd been seeing previously. So, that's nothing like the 100, 200,000 nests that were recorded, historically. But it nonetheless shows that, again, if we get the water right, these areas still can recover and can support very large numbers of birds. And we have to remember that, some of this was helped by various restoration initiatives that came online in 2017 and a little bit previous to that, and shortly thereafter as well. But restoration in the larger sense hasn't even really started yet. So there's far more to come. So these data, they're great. They show we can recover the Everglades. They show we can cover these indicator species, these wading birds. But they don't really show why this happened. They don't give you, we've got this loose association between water levels and drying, and that creates this great, wonderful feeding. So we've got a basic idea of what's going on, but we don't understand the absolute mechanisms that are driving these super colony events on the coast. And to be able to guide water management and to guide restoration, we need to understand those mechanisms of how it all works. And so that's what I'm going to talk about now. A number of studies that we've been doing in the last few years that have really sort of improved our knowledge of why this all happened and the sort of the foundational mechanisms of what drives these colonies. And so there was quite a bit of luck involved with all of this understanding. So my colleague, Nate Dawn, who gave a presentation here a few months ago, Professor Nate Dawn he was at FAU, now he's at Florida International University. We actually initiated a project to look at the diet of what these birds were feeding on these coastal colonies. Now remember, the foundation of all this is food, the prey of these birds, okay? So the first thing we need to understand is what these birds are eating before we can really understand their foraging ecology. So Nate and I had been working for about 5 or 6 years prior to all this in the water conservation areas, and in this area, these birds are feeding on many things. They can feed on fish. They can even feed on lawn cockroaches when they're feeding, in people's lawns in the urban areas. And during certain conditions, they'll actually feed their chicks there in the Everglades. They'll fly all the way to the urban areas. But under the good conditions, the main prey species that drives and that triggers these large nesting events and basically fuels these super colonies, at least in the water conservation areas, was this species called the slough crayfish. It lives in the ridge, lives in the ridge and slough landscape. This was the main species that drives everything. Getting this prey species right was absolutely essential to supporting these big nesting events in the water conservation areas. But in the Everglades National Park, we've got a different situation. For one, we have two species of crayfish. We've got the slough crayfish that lives in the wetter slough regions, but we also have this Everglades crayfish, Procambrus alleni. This lives in the marl prairies. It prefers shorter hydroperiod areas that dry out every now and again. So it prefers these shorter hydroperiod areas of the marl prairies. In these coastal colonies, we've also got the mangrove region as well, the marsh mangrove ecotone, as we call it. And here we have all sorts of, well, actually it's somewhat of a black box, but we do know that there are fish and there are, these estuarine crabs such as fiddler crabs and mangrove crabs and all sorts of other species that these birds could feed on. So it wasn't clear which species would be driving these coastal nesting events. And so we set up a project in 3 colonies along this, in this area where these birds historically nested in the Fertile Crescent. 3 different colonies: Cabbage Bay, Broad River, and Otter Creek. And also here we have Eden 3. That's just a water gauge. I'm going to be showing you stages of water in a minute, but just to note that this is where we took water levels. Now these circles represent what we call the core foraging area of these birds. It's kind of the distance that these birds will fly to and from the colony to get food. They will fly further if need be, but this is the primary area. And what we can see here, if we, just looking at this sort of satellite image, is it looks like we got different habitats split in half in these core foraging areas. To the south and west, this is the mangrove habitat, and to the north and north and east, we have the marl prairies. And actually further to the southeast, we have slough habitat as well. So there's 3 actual habitats, potential choices where these birds can forage. And each of these has different prey species. And we were very lucky in the fact that we did this just as we were having these amazing hydrologic, these very, very wet years. So actually, we were initially planning to do this study in 2016 and 2017. We didn't get the permits in time, which was an absolute godsend, because it meant we did it in 2017, which is a moderately wet year, an average year, really. It was slightly wetter than average, but only about 1,000 ibis nests in these 3 colonies. But we so lucked out that we did it during this amazing 2018 year, which was extremely wet, and we had 30,000 nests. So, we were able to compare what these birds were feeding on during, kind of crappy conditions versus what they would have been feeding on probably during, historic conditions. And so just to, show you what these different habitats look like, here's the, Shark River slough habitat. This is, showing the system when it's dried down towards the end of the dry season. This is when the birds are typically feeding in Shark River slough. You can see all the white dots. These are pelicans and lots of wading birds. And, the main major prey here are fish and the slough crayfish. There's also the marsh mangrove ecotone habitat. This can be quite variable, but this is just a shot of some huge flocks that I saw in 2021 in amongst all the mangroves. Again, like I said, fiddler crabs, all sorts of different crab species. And, you know, when we got lots of freshwater flows, it can also be extremely productive for fish as well. And then, of course, the marl prairie habitat that I've mentioned, those pink areas on the map I showed earlier, this is the habitat of the Everglades crayfish. It's not particularly fishy, it dries down, but when it's wet enough for long enough, for about 10 months of the year, it can be absolutely wonderful for producing crayfish. All right, and this study was just a fun adventure. So I'm just going to show you how we went about this study, just for a little bit of fun. These colonies are extremely remote. There's no access. The only way in is to get a helicopter, get dropped in on the outskirts of these colonies. It's thick sawgrass. It's a marl soil. So when you jump out of the helicopter, you basically sink up to your chest, and then you have to slog it through various areas to get to the actual colony itself. The easiest way was to travel up these creeks. When we traveled up these creeks, you know, it's not unusual to have lemon sharks and bull sharks in these creeks. Where, you know, as we walked up, we would see alligators drop off banks into the water ahead of us. So it was, you know, just a fun but hairy experience just getting into these colonies. We then had to, you know, negotiate this maze of mangroves to get to the birds that we were studying. I didn't care about the sharks and the alligators. I'm somewhat claustrophobic, so the thought of getting lost in mangroves like this was far more scary to me than actually traveling up these creeks. When we got out of those mangroves, I think this area where I've got the pointer here now is where we would come out. And this just shows how important wading birds are to Everglades functioning, and particularly the white ibis. The white ibis, they're not the prettiest. You know, we see them on our lawns. They're not the rarest, but they are the most abundant. And when they are abundant, as they should be in the hundreds of thousands, they have such an important impact on the functionality of the Everglades. And here, you know, when you have 30-odd thousand white ibis nests, this is what you attract, these alligators, hundreds of them. Laurie Oberhofer from the park estimated that this lake supported about 500 alligators, and we had to cross this to get to the white ibis. But as I was saying about just how important these ibis are, without the ibis, you don't get as many alligators. Alligators are our keystone species. Large nesting aggregations of wading birds are a keystone function in the Everglades because they provide so much nutrients and energetic supply to many other animals. So that's why having so many of these birds is important to Everglades functioning. But anyway, just interesting that it was always fun to try to cross this with all these alligators. And then when we got to where the birds were, we still had to deal with large pythons eating our birds, and and at times the mosquitoes were just horrendous. I can't even explain. Okay, so just a little storyline there. So this is what we were after. This is what our goal was. We were to try to find these white ibis nestlings shortly after they were being fed by their parents. Okay, and the idea was to try to get the prey that they had been fed, and that's kind of made quite easy. That's the easiest part of this this project, because these white ibis, as a anti-predator response, when a raccoon goes up to these guys, these birds will throw up their last meal. It's gross, but it's not. It's the food that they keep and crush up in their crops. So it's not quite as vomitous as it sounds, but it's pretty gross. And then, so when we approached these birds, they would throw up and we would collect what we call a bolus. And here's just a couple examples. Here's a bolus of the fiddler crab, and here's a crayfish. You can see all the crushed up pieces of crayfish. And we would take these back to the lab, analyze their contents for what species, and that, for the most part, was it. We were working with Everglades National Park as well, and Everglades National Park helped by putting out these traps across, particularly in the Marl Prairie areas. And so they were actually trapping crayfish to determine the relative abundance of crayfish during those 2 years, the 2017 and 2018. So we had an indication of how many crayfish there were in the system during those 2 years. Okay, so this is basically the water levels of that gauge I was talking about, Eden 3, and in 2018 and 2017. And this is during the nestling period. So the nestling period is generally sort of end of March, early April, all the way through to the end of May. That's when the birds are feeding their chicks. And the first thing to note is 2018, as expected, was much wetter than 2017. And the effect of that, without going into the details of how we did it, was that there was about 5 times the amount of foraging habitat available to these birds in the Marl Prairies in 2018 than there was in 2017. And that trapping data I was telling you about also showed, because of those wet conditions were conducive to crayfish production, we had about 7 times more crayfish produced in 2018 than we did 2017. So more habitat and more prey in 2018 versus 2017. It's no surprise we saw 30,000 nests versus 1,000 nests. But what were the birds eating? So this is about as complicated as it gets, and it's not that complicated. The numbers refer n equals 6, n equals 5. That's just the number of boluses we collected on a given date. And the colors represent the proportion of each of the prey species that was in that combination of 6 or 5 boluses. So, and what we see here is that at the beginning of 2017, these birds were able to eat quite a lot of crayfish, at least on that first date. But primarily, we got most of these boluses were this gray color. That's crabs. So for the most part, it seems they were reliant on these estuarine crabs. Now, estuarine crabs are salty, and young ibis do not have the ability to process that salt. So the adults do, but the young do not until they're older. And so for a chick, these crabs are, physiologically not good for these birds. They're taking in an awful lot of salt. They're dehydrating themselves. It's not conducive for growth and survival. It's a poor prey choice. So even in a relatively wet year of 2017, these birds are having to feed, by the looks of things, in these mangrove regions and provide them with a prey that isn't suitable. In 2018, however, it was a different story. Here we see a lot more of this brown crayfish, particularly at the beginning of the nesting season, at the nestling period of nesting, what they're feeding their chicks on. It was dominated largely by crayfish. The amount of fish increases towards the end of the season and actually becomes greater than the amount of crayfish towards the end of the season. And so what that suggests is these birds are feeding on crayfish to start with, and then slowly towards the end of the season, it's fish. Now, also what we were able to do is distinguish between the two species of crayfish. And what we saw is that the Everglades crayfish, the species from the Marl Prairies, dominated during this initial period. And then at the end, it swapped to the slough crayfish. So this suggests that the birds, the major crayfish that's triggering these large nesting events and supporting them for the most part is this Everglades crayfish. And it seems that at the end, that when the marl prairies dried down and the sloughs became shallow enough to feed in, that's when they're able to feed on fish and the slough crayfish. So, where are these birds actually feeding though? We've got this indication that these birds probably are feeding in these marl prairies because they're feeding on this Everglades crayfish. But we don't know for sure. There are Everglades crayfish in the slough habitats, and there are slough crayfish in the marl prairie habitats. So, it's not, we can't say for certain that they are actually foraging in these marl prairies, and these marl prairies are super important for these large nesting events. So, we really need to find out where these birds are foraging. So, what I did is try to figure out where they're foraging. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to do any surveys during that 2018 because we were just so busy doing this other study. But again, luck came my way, and I'll explain why in a second. So this is a water depth map of the Everglades. Up here we have the Loctachie National Wildlife Refuge. Down here we have Everglades National Park, and this area here is that coastal zone that we're foraging on, that we're focusing on, and here is the marl prairies, and we can see that at the beginning of that dry season, November 2017, leading into that excellent 2018 year, it was very wet, extremely wet. That's what produced all those crayfish. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to do foraging surveys in that year, but in 2020, we had almost identical conditions. Remember, this once in a lifetime nesting event happened twice in 4 years. And so when I saw these conditions in November 2020, leading into the 2021 nesting season, I thought, this is the ideal opportunity to be able to go out and see where these birds are foraging and test this hypothesis that these birds are foraging in these marl prairies. And that's the really important habitat. And so, and it also predicted that we were going to have this beautiful dry down in 2021 during the dry season as well. And so we had almost identical conditions. And just to show that these were really wet conditions, this is what it looks like in a typical year. This is 15th of November in 2021, leading into the average 22 nesting season, where we only had 30-odd thousand nests. And we can see that these marl prairies, even at the height of the wet season, just before the dry season started, that these areas were pretty dry. In fact, some areas were already dry, so barely even wet for more than a month or two, which is just terrible for crayfish production. Okay, so then I started this foraging survey of the Everglades. I did the entire Everglades, covered the entire Everglades, but I focused on areas that were most conducive, with depths that were most conducive to foraging. I did this once a week. I did it from a helicopter, and I basically took photos of every single foraging flock that I encountered in my survey. And so we could get sort of really good counts of these foraging flocks and how many birds were foraging in these areas. And I made a number of predictions. I first predicted that these birds will forage along the coast in the fall. If we go back, we can see that there's no way that they're foraging here in the fall. It's just far too deep, okay? So if they're going to be foraging anywhere, it will be in the fall. It will be in the fall. It will be along the coast in the fall. Then I would predict that as we moved into the early spring and the period during which these birds are providing food to their nestlings, that's when we'd see that the water levels come down in the marl prairies, and that's when the birds would move into the marl prairies. And so we'd see the birds move into the marl prairies at that time. And then when the marl prairies became too dry towards the end of the nesting period, that's when we would see the birds move into the sloughs. But these hypotheses, these predictions are different, are new. They're not what has been expected as part of Everglades restoration. We basically predicted that if we put a lot of water down Shark River Slough and to the coast, these birds would be foraging along the coastal margins for the majority. The marl prairies were rarely a factor in this equation at all. So this is kind of a new hypothesis, and it's based largely on the diet study that we just did. Okay, so here is another water depth map of the Everglades leading up into the 2021 nesting season. Now, one thing to note that I haven't said about these maps is that it not only is a depth map, but these colors correspond to conditions that are favorable or not to these wading birds. So the green color are depths that these birds are optimal depths for foraging for these birds. The blue are typically too deep, and the brown are typically too dry. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through the year, through the dry season, during the nesting period, and show how these birds are using the system and whether or not they sort of gel with my predictions that I've just shown you. So what I'm going to show you is some foraging areas. These red areas will show foraging areas. The stars show just when active colonies. So in the 1st of December 2021, we were starting to get colonies forming already. Oh, another point to mention is these water depth models don't extend to the coast, unfortunately. It's a tidal system, and it's just so much more difficult to model these areas. But these coastal areas are typically drier than the rest of the Everglades. So that's why we would predict that we would see these birds here initially, and then they would move up towards the marl prairies. So I started in November, December, and this is what we saw. Absolutely incredible numbers of birds, unprecedented numbers of birds foraging in these coastal regions. About 40,000 nests, about 20,000 in the Florida Bay region, and about 20,000. And this lasted for a number of months, just an incredible number of birds. They're not foraging up here because it's basically too deep. So as we predicted, these birds start off in these coastal regions with all these flows, all this fresh water. It's really pumped up productivity of fish and crabs, everything else that these birds are able to forage on. And what surprised me is these birds were even foraging in the bay itself. There was so much productivity that these birds were actually foraging in a place called Snakebite, which is actually into the bay. That was unexpected. Okay, so as we move towards the end of January, we're still seeing a lot of birds along the coast. It's still wet. There's still a lot of birds. At this point, these birds down here are mixed species. It's wood storks, it's great egrets, it's white ibis, it's spoonbills, it's everything. But now we can see these green areas coming online in the Big Cypress and the marl prairies. And because of the wet conditions earlier in the season, it's produced a lot of crayfish, and these birds are starting to forage there in fairly large numbers. Now we're heading to the period where the birds are just starting to nest. The coastal region is drying down. Fewer birds are feeding in this area now, but now we're really seeing this prediction come to light. These birds are foraging in the marl prairies in numbers that I had no clue that they would be foraging in. 20,000 birds foraging in the western marl prairies, and another 5 at least in the prairies, the southern end of Big Cypress. Huge numbers that are feeding on crayfish, getting into condition ready for nesting. And, you know, as we thought, that this area and the Everglades crayfish is just the animal that these birds need to trigger nesting. Now, April, we no longer see any on the coast. It's dry here now. We're not, there are areas that are suitable for nesting in Shark Slough and Taylor Slough, but we're not seeing any birds foraging in these regions. Where we're seeing them all during this nestling period, when when they're bringing food back to their nestlings, is the marl prairies. Now, note, the numbers have dropped, but there's a good reason for that. Half the birds are now sitting on nests. We've got 30,000 nests, and most of the birds are either sitting on eggs or protecting young chicks. So only half the birds are able to forage at a time. So that's why we're seeing this drop in the number, but it's the relative number we're seeing compared to elsewhere that's important. These birds are foraging in the western marl prairies. This area is key for these for triggering and supporting these coastal colonies. Now, as we head towards May, now we're heading towards the end of the nesting period. The marl prairies are now dry. These birds, the only areas where they can forage are these deeper sloughs, the remnants of the water that's left in these deeper sloughs. These sloughs are deeper. Because they're deeper, they're more fishy, and they've got these concentrated pools now. So now this is why the birds are feeding on fish and the slough crayfish at this time of year. So the pattern we saw of the prey species they were eating in 2018 was reflected almost exactly in where we saw these birds foraging in the similar year of 2021. So in summary, what we need to restore these birds is a lot more water in the system, a lot more flows to these coastal areas, and then a nice dry down during the dry season. That leads to optimal prey productivity and prey accessibility at the right time and place. It seems that the Everglades crayfish is the key prey species for triggering these massive coastal colonies on the coast. Although, earlier in the season, they will be feeding on other species before they're feeding the chicks. So we need more work to understand what they're eating earlier in the season. And it's all about location and timing. We need these higher water levels, not just to produce the prey, but it also allows for these birds the water levels to come down at the right time and the right place, just near these colonies, to be able to support foraging close to the colonies in these marl prairie areas. That's what we know, primarily what we need to do. So in terms of Everglades restoration, I'm not going to go into the details of it, but the main idea really at the moment is, and what we're primarily aiming for in terms of where we're putting water, is largely down either Shark River Slough and Taylor Slough, and this is great. Even during drier years now, putting this extra water. My colleague Chris, who's in the audience, we were in Florida Bay a few weeks ago. We're seeing more freshwater flows now into Florida Bay in the coastal region, and we're seeing, even in a sort of average dry year, a lot more birds forage in these coastal margins, and all sorts of other species, shorebirds, pelicans, more turtles. We're just anecdotally seeing a lot more animals and a lot more diversity than we have in recent years. And that's largely because we're now seeing, irrespective of these tropical climatic events, more water coming down into Florida Bay and also into Shark River Slough. Now that is great because it is providing these wetter conditions in these coastal regions that we, I showed these 40,000 birds there, and we need that. That attracts the birds to the Everglades. That keeps them here, and that triggers these coastal nesting events. Without that, I don't think that we'll be getting these nesting events, not just by ibis, but by wood-storks, great egrets, and the other species as well. But what we really need is more flows down here, down Lossman Slough, and wetter conditions in these western marl prairies to recover the hydro periods that are just, for the most part, too dry now. Now there is something called the Western Everglades Restoration Project, WERP. It was cancelled once, came back to life again, and hopefully that will allow us to put more water down this area. But again, now we're running into troubles again with this restoration project. It needs a stormwater treatment area to clean the water before it goes into Big Cypress. That it was scrapped because they were going to build it in an old growth cypress forest, which wasn't a good idea, and quite rightly was stopped. But there is a lot of animosity from various groups that really don't want more water in this region. And so whether this is going to happen or not, I don't know. But if we want to restore these colonies, I believe it's absolutely essential that we are able somehow to send more water through Lossman Slough and over these marl prairies. Now we've got some other issues to do that. This is the region where Cape Sable seaside sparrows nest, and they need much drier habitat to live and breed properly. Although they are more to the east, sorry. So I still think we can do both. I still think we can put a lot more water this way and keep this area relatively dry. And there's also another wrench in the works that Nate Dawn has shown recently, and that's this guy. These guys, the Asian swamp eel, started invading the C111 area of the Eastern Everglades, that's this area here, back in about 2011. We didn't really hear much about them until very recently, but they've now spread throughout Taylor Slough. They've spread up through Shark River Slough, and are now entering the southern water conservation areas. And corresponding with that, we've seen a significant drop in both crayfish populations in these regions and in fish populations. We basically see no crayfish now in Taylor Slough. And crayfish do well when areas dry out, and this area does dry out. But this Asian swamp eel, unlike the fish that we have in the native fish that we have in the Everglades, has a little trick up its sleeve. It's actually able to estivate without water for a number of months, just like the crayfish are able to do. So, by drying this system out, we can get rid of the other fish, but this guy just survives and increases in population, and it's having a detrimental effect on fish populations in this area. Now, a lot of these invasive species, they often boom and bust. They can be very frightening to start with, but then all of a sudden, the jewel cichlid was one species that we were really worried about a few years ago, but their numbers have declined quite dramatically. So the same could happen here. But if it doesn't, this species could be a far worse problem even than the python. And if it moves up into the marl prairies, then which it's likely to do, then yeah, it's not good news. And I don't really want to leave it on that note. I do think we're monitoring this species closely. I'm fingers crossed that it'll do what most species do and decline again. But I will keep you informed. And with that, I will take any questions with this cute picture of a young white ibis.
That was a great presentation, Mark. Thank you so much. There are a couple questions in the chat. It's almost 9 o'clock, so we'll try to go through them, a little bit quickly.
Yeah.
But the first question was from Jeanette. She wanted to know, is the Fertile Crescent protected from development?
Oh, yes. All these areas are completely protected from development. All the water conservation areas, Big Cypress, and of course, Everglades National Park. So yeah, the Fertile Crescent is within Everglades National Park. Not only is it in Everglades National Park, but it's designated wilderness region. So it's about as protected as you're ever going to get.
Awesome. That's fantastic. I will add, I am working on a couple WERP projects, so they are going through now.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. Next question is Julia Norris. She mentioned that she missed why wood storks were nesting later. This was something that you mentioned early on in your presentation.
Yeah, so I didn't. You didn't miss it because I didn't go into details for the reason why. But basically, we have a lot less water in the system. These areas. We think these birds are feeding in the coastal regions or the mild prairies very early in the nesting season. And well, historically, they were feeding in these areas. And what with drainage, there's a lot less fresh water. There's a lot less productivity of prey. So these birds can't actually feed in these areas early in the season anymore. So they have to wait until the slough areas become available. So when the slough areas, the water levels drop, they have to wait for that. And when those areas become available, that's when they can start feeding and nesting. But that is later in the season than when these short hydroperiod marshes and the coastal regions historically did so.
Makes sense. Kevin Baker says that he says, I have a 20-acre wetland next to Riverbend Park that is owned by the Loxahatchee River Environmental Control District. Is that area big enough to set up a nesting area? And if so, what design elements would most facilitate this?
Did it say wood storks?
No, it didn't specify a species.
Well, yeah, a 20-acre would be, okay, so it probably, so most of the birds, these wading birds, at least the wood storks and the white ibis, they need not just an area to nest, but they need a large foraging area. And so the Loxahatchee area, it probably isn't large enough to support a large nesting event. On the other hand, though, it probably could be a good area to support some of the smaller herons, such as the little blues, the snowy egrets. Those birds do very well in areas like Pine Glades and Riverbend and Cypress Creek. But what you need for that, to encourage nesting, you need an area, a lake-like, pretty much like Wakota-Hatchee. You need an island surrounded by water. That's the key to get birds nesting. So if you created an area that stays wet for long enough, that has a moat around it. Remember that photo I showed with all those alligators surrounding all those wading birds? So not only do the wading birds support those alligators by providing, chicks that fall out of the nest, those alligators support the wading birds by protecting them from their main predator, which is raccoons. So wading birds will not nest unless they have water below them.
All right. Penny Prey wants to know, where are we going to get the extra water to flood the mall prairies? And a second question is, do you think that raising the roads through the Everglades will aid in the restoration of water?
Okay, so the second part of that question was about raising the roads. That's already happened. And yes, it's already helping. That's kind of, we had all these really wet years with the hurricanes and everything, but raising the roads and and various other restoration projects that we have in the Taylor Slough region have really helped sort of channel water into Taylor Slough and into Shark River Slough, and that's sending more water south. Now, the big question is, where are we going to get all this extra water? We can't be relying on hurricanes to dump water in the exact right place every year. We actually have enough water. In the watershed starts off near Orlando, down the Kissimmee River into Lake Okeechobee, and then heads south. The bottleneck is cleaning the lake water, which is full of nutrients, and we can do that to some extent by passing it through the SDAs, which many of you have visited, and I've given tours there before. So we clean that water, but right now it's a bottleneck. We still are not able to clean enough water quickly enough to send to the south. But one of the major restoration features is to create a reservoir, more SDAs to clean the water, so we'll have a greater supply of water. And not only that, there's a lot more other projects going on that keep more water. We're putting in these concrete curtains that go down, I don't know, 50 feet or so, that block water flowing underground towards Miami, that keep it in the Everglades and keep it flowing to the south. We are filling in some of the canals, backfilling the canals, which will stop, prevent drainage of the water out of the Everglades. So, there's a lot of things going on that will be occurring in the next 10 years or so that are going to enable us to not only supply more water, but to keep more water where we want it to be, and to be able to put it where we want it to be. But that work, that Western Everglades restoration project in Big Cypress, I think is going to be key to what we need in terms of creating those coastal colonies.
Yeah, definitely. And groundbreaking on the EAA reservoir is later this month. Everybody stay tuned, watch the news. So Carol Watson says this was an absolutely fascinating presentation. Do you know what the hundreds of millions of dollars that DeSantis has promised is going to do for the Everglades? Is the money already earmarked?
I don't know the politics or the source of the money. Do you mind if I don't answer that?
I can answer a little bit. So I work in the group at the Water Management District that actually, builds these projects from the beginning, and everybody was very excited about it. So I do believe that the money is going to be used well. Kevin Baker had a comment that he just said the Loxahatchee River District has extra water that is pumped below the lower aquifer. So that, when that's related to, I believe, to the comment about the nesting habitat in the 20 acres.
Yeah, so having extra water is great. I'd really like to see that water go into Pine Glades or stay in Pine Glades a little bit longer. We haven't really done an awful lot of research, but my kind of working hypothesis is that, these wonderful areas that Palm Beach County and other areas and other groups have restored, such as Pine Glades, Cypress Creek, the Loxahatchee, the Loxahatchee River area, huge areas are being restored. These areas are critical for these birds. These birds don't just function in the Everglades, they function at a much larger landscape scale. And prior to the nesting season, what attracts these birds to come to South Florida is Pine Glades and areas around Lake Okeechobee and River Bend. So, any wetland that we can restore, I think helps wading birds nest in the Everglades.
Very nice. June Porter says, many thanks for a marvelous presentation. Chris Madden says that he will ask you some questions tomorrow. And then Cherry, who came on the flamingo tour with us last year, she has a follow-up. Maybe you can follow up offline because we are running a little late, but she says, any details from samples collected from the flamingos foraging in the STA last March?
Yeah, we're still working on that. I'm too busy
All
giving
right.
presentations to Audubon to, to work on this.
Audubon taking up all our time. And then
Just joking.
Fredlin says, thank you for an excellent program. Penny says, perhaps we can use the extra water for Riverbend that dried out way too much last year. And then Rick Schofield just says, many thanks. This was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
So yeah, with that, that's the end of all. I have some questions that I'll touch base with you later on as well. So with that, thank you so much, Mark, and I'll hand it over to Scott.
Thank you, Mark. That was brilliant as always. And thank you, Natasha, for stepping in for Autumn. And by the way, to everyone, both Mark and we're so lucky at Audubon Everglades, both Mark and Natasha are part of our Science Advisory Committee. And so all this knowledge that you're hearing tonight, we get the benefit of at Audubon Everglades. And we're so grateful for that. And we do keep them busy. We do our best. Thanks again, Mark. That was wonderful. And thanks for taking the time to put this great presentation together. And everybody, so let me just share my screen real quickly. And we will see you again on March 7th, I hope, for a wonderful presentation by Dr. Richard Bilfus. And that will be on how the cranes are wonderful ambassadors for conservation. Look forward to seeing you then. Have a great month. Go out and do some birding because the birds are still here. All those winter visitors are still here. And hopefully we'll get to see you out there. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. Have a great night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
If you're still here, you can see my robin that I got today.
Oh, that's cute.
Yeah, it was coming into land, so it had the full wings out.
Yeah, that's a great moment to see the robin that way in that beautiful red breast.
Have a good one.